The following is rated S for spoilers.
What do you call this miracle ore?
In our tongue, grey glitter. In yours, something like me throud.
No, it would be Mithril.
Hello and welcome to the Popcorn Hangover. My name is Alex, and today we are discussing Amazon's Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, created by Patrick McKay, John D. Payne, starring Morphy Clark, Ismael Cruz Cordova, Charlie Vickers, Markella Kavanagh, Megan Richards, Sarah Zwangbani. So many people in this show. Today, I am flying solo, discussing a relatively controversial show, in my opinion. I feel like either people really, really love it or people really, really hate it. My personal thoughts, I really, really loved this show. I was a little skeptical at first, particularly when the first two episodes dropped. I was a little nervous, especially just considering some of the other Lord of the Rings content we've gotten since Peter Jackson's original trilogy, to be honest. And I was worried that they were going to do lots of things wrong, and while they didn't do everything right, I do feel like they did most of the things right, and I really enjoyed it. Each week, I was highly anticipating the next episode dropping. But I do understand some of the critiques and complaints that others have had about the show. So let's just jump into this episode and my thoughts on Rings of Power. Like I said, I was a little skeptical at first, but going into it, there were a few things that I was really looking for. As a major Lord of the Rings fan, I remember reading The Hobbit when I was in like the 5th grade. And The Hobbit is still a book that I read pretty consistently every few years because what Tolkien did in just creating this world was so impressive, and no one has been able to do it to that scale since him. I know people have gotten close, but nothing is quite like Lord of the Rings. And I feel like a lot of the issues that people are having with it are from people who are only familiar with particularly Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy of films, but also are only really familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a whole, and maybe even The Hobbit as well. But there is so much more to Tolkien in this world that he created. I remember in high school, I was in an English class, and it was called the Culture Project. And so everyone was supposed to pick a different world culture or a different period of time and find a way to present how they told stories in that culture. And so most of them were kind of like origin myths, origins of the universe and things like that. And so you have people telling stories of like a Nazi in Africa, or the different versions of the Jewish and Christian origins and things like that. And I told my teacher, I said, hey, have you heard of the Silmarillion before? And he said, I have. And I thought, well, that's kind of like the origin of a very, very specific culture. I mean, while yes, it is fictional, it definitely seems very real with how in-depth and everything that like Tolkien was able to create. And I was like, can I do my project on the Silmarillion? And my teacher thought about it for a minute. And he said, yeah, I think that could work. And I did, and it was super fun. For those of you that don't know, the Silmarillion is kind of a collection of stories, really. But it opens with the creation of the Tolkien universe. And part of that it's actually quite beautiful. It's all about the universe was created through song. And so you have this god, I forget his name, but basically sang everything into creation. And it was really cool getting to convey that. And I basically just told the story by playing a piece of music and just talking over it. Anyway, I say all of that just to say I'm a really big Lord of the Rings fan, and with that, I had very, very high expectations for this show, especially considering that I did kind of have some knowledge of this time period and the stories that they were going to attempt to tackle. But there were a few things that caught my mind right off the bat. And I feel like one of the biggest narratives around this show is the budget. Assuming that they do manage to release all 5 seasons that they are planning, it will be the biggest budget show of all time. I saw somewhere that if they released all 5 seasons, they would be coming under just under $1 billion. But also, this season alone cost them $500 million. And some other sources are saying that each episode cost about $60 million. Guys, that's a lot of money. We've talked about movies that had a smaller budget than $60 million. Even Disney Plus, Marvel, and Star Wars shows typically come in about $25 million per episode, and those look like blockbuster films. And this one had a very, very large budget of $60 million per episode. And I was trying to going into it, I was very curious as to how they were going to utilize that budget, because $60 million can mean a lot of different things. There's this really great YouTube channel. I'll try to link it down in the description below. I can't remember the guy's name, but he does this really great series of videos that he basically says this director at 3 different budgets. And so he'll talk about how Nolan created, Following, his first film, for about $6,000, and then you have Memento, which he did for $9 million, and then you have Inception, which he did for, I want to say, $160 million. And how that he approached those 3 different levels of filmmaking using different budgets. And the reason I say Nolan in particular is because he's been very consistent with his style and the way that he approaches filmmaking just in general, starting with Following and going all the way up until, I'm going to assume, Oppenheimer, when that releases in the next year. And I think it's very interesting how you can look how different artists allocate their budgets towards different things. And the other thing to consider as well here is that the standard is that you spend double your budget on marketing. So assuming that they spent $60 million per episode, coming in at nearly $500 million for the entire series, we're looking at a lot of money that they would have spent just on top of also marketing. Once you include marketing, you're looking at a ton of money that they spent on a show that anyone gets just by having Amazon Prime. I don't pay for Prime Video. I pay for it because it's also included with Amazon Prime, and I like 2-day shipping and all of that. So I feel like Amazon does do a really good job at this is way off topic, but Amazon does a really great job at really creating value in their subscription, getting Prime Video, and I'm pretty sure you get like Audible perks. There's stuff with like Twitch, and you get like free games, and you get Amazon Music, and they really do put a ton of value into their subscription model, which is greatly appreciated. That's neither here nor there. But I'm curious at how they're able to justify that, because it's hard. I feel like it's got to be hard to track exactly what services people are using what services it is that are really like pushing people to buy a Prime subscription. Because like I said, I use Prime Video solely because I have normal Amazon Prime for shopping and shipping purposes. And so I wonder how they're justifying that, and if maybe, I don't know, is some of their like warehouse profits coming, some of the warehouse profits like being allocated towards making these shows and these movies and things. That's something I really want to dive into more. And if you do know, please let me know. But yeah, it's a massive budget. Wow, I went way on a tangent there. Back to the topic at hand. The way they allocated this budget was something that I went into and was really cognizant of as I was watching the show. And what they did with that budget was immediately made aware to me in a few different scenarios. For the majority of you that I assume don't know, a lot of film budgets when they're being, written down, you have your top of the line budget and you have your bottom of the line budget. And top of the line, I guess you could summarize as saying, are the people who have the most direct creative control, which I don't totally agree with, but I think that's the best all-encompassing way to say that. So top of the line, you're going to look at your directors, your screenwriters, your actors, things like that. The people who are kind of the face of the movie, really. And with that are going to be the most expensive, typically, to hire and to get to work on the film. And then you have your bottom of the line, which is all of your lesser, quote unquote, lesser stuff. So your editors, your cinematographers, your crew, grips, gaffers, all that jazz. And so it's interesting when you look at different films, which they prioritize. Do you prioritize your top of the line? Do you hire the best writers, the best directors, the best actors, or do you go more bottom of the line? And do you focus on getting the best cinematographer or the best editor? Or in this case, the Rings of Power's case, one of the things that they did was they spent a ton of money on the bottom of the line, and specifically in the art department. When they went to Numenor in the show, which is this really grand, just epic place that you hear all about in The Lord of the Rings, and with it being gone and everything, and were these massive, majestic people, and seeing Numenor in the way that they created it and they brought it to life was just magical to me. Having all these thoughts in my head, but the art department, I think, might be the MVP of this show, in my opinion. As a whole, I think this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I feel like you could screenshot any frame from this show and put it in a frame, and it would be the best piece of art you have in your home. Like everything just looks so good, and I was constantly trying to figure out what it was, and I couldn't quite put my finger on exactly what it was that they were doing that just made everything look so grand and magical and just, quite frankly, beautiful. Especially considering a lot of it was CG. There was a ton of CG in this show, and a few times it was noticeable and it wasn't amazing. But that's how CG works. But for the most part, I was really impressed with the way this looked, and I say the art department in particular might be the MVP because, particularly when they're in Numenor, but really anywhere in the show, there's so much detail, and it was done so expertly, like to a point where I didn't notice it for several episodes. But then once I did, and I knew to actually kind of look for it, it was everywhere. And I can only assume, I've only seen the show once. I wanted to see it twice, but it's a very long show, even though it is only 6 episodes. There's just so much, every inch of anything was just covered in so much detail. And it's one of those small things where, like I said, it took me several episodes to notice, and I feel like most people won't notice. But it's one of those very small things that you can do as a filmmaker to really immerse somebody in the world. Just introducing all of these different details, and especially with the Asian, or especially with the Aegean kind of style that Numenor was giving off. At least that's kind of how I was feeling about it, in that kind of Greek Aegean kind of thing. A lot of the details on the walls were also telling their own stories in different ways, and it really helps to immerse you in this world. And that's going to bring me to my second point. Fantastic segue, Alex. This show, I think, did a really great job at honoring Tolkien and what he was trying to accomplish, and what he did accomplish with his writings in this Lord of the Rings universe. And I know this is a very controversial statement because I have seen so many headlines and reviews and things saying that it's a disgrace to Tolkien. And we'll get into some of the reasons why I think they're saying that later. But there were lots of creative decisions here that I think were made that just that were made with Tolkien in mind. For example, just the complete immersion into this world, the extra mile that was went to really just into detail to help really immerse you into the world that you're in. Tolkien could have just written a few books and given just the details that you needed to know, but he didn't do that. Instead, he wrote languages and entire histories and backgrounds explaining the civilizations and governments and how they work. Nobody does that. That's ridiculous. But when you do end up doing that, when you're telling a story in a very fantastical world, it feels super real because everything has some bit of sense to it, I guess. For example, if we contrast this to J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, who I think J.K. Rowling did a fantastic job at creating that world. I love the wizarding world of Harry Potter. But if you sit down and you think about it for more than 5 seconds, you realize that there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense. The politics make zero sense. The way that wizards and muggles live in the same world just doesn't make sense. Why do wizards have this magic and like some things are modern, but most things aren't? And like none of it really makes any sense. And it's okay because that's part of that world, I guess. But J.K. Rowling she took more time than most to create that world and why I think it's so loved. She didn't take as much time as Tolkien did. She didn't create entire histories. She mentions histories, sure. She mentions Newt Scamander and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. But then whenever it comes time to actually writing those things, we get Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which I have behind me. And it was a complete and utter train wreck. And I really hope that they cut it off. I haven't even seen the newest one, full transparency, because it just makes me sad to watch this turn into a rant on Fantastic Beasts. But I say all that just to say, like, even some of the greatest world building ever done with J.K. Rowling, with Harry Potter, it still does not live up to the level that Tolkien was able to, and just with the logic that was put into creating the world, and giving everything a purpose. And I'm going to go with that. Just giving everything a purpose and everything kind of makes sense and there's a history there. That's brilliant and it's on a whole new level. And so how do you take that and how do you translate it to the screen without Tolkien there anymore? That's really difficult. And lots of people have tried. If you look at Peter Jackson with the Hobbit trilogy, he tried to, introduce more of Tolkien's world and things and kind of tell his own story, and it was awful. How can you make a 3-hour movie that is based on 2.5 pages of a book? And for most of the 2.5 pages of those book, your main character is passed out. That doesn't make any sense to me. And he failed utterly. One of my favorite games of all time is Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War series. Those games are fantastic, and it's a great way to, like, just in general, they're really great games. The gameplay is amazing. The story, self-contained, is really great, and it also kind of immerses you into this world of Lord of the Rings, getting to run around and fight orcs and explore these different lanes, particularly in Shadow of War. But none of it makes any sense. You have this ranger who gets captured and then he's turned into a ghost, and he teams up with the ghost of Celebrimbor, who forged the rings, and they combine to come back into the real world and get revenge on Sauron. But then by the end, they end up killing Sauron, and Celebrimbor is inside the eye, and then Talion becomes one of the ringwraiths, and it makes zero sense. And you're like, wait, how did you get so far off? And even some of the stuff that is really interesting, like having the Blade of Galadriel show up, and she's kind of helping you out, and that's a cool idea, and it's a cool concept, but that's not based on anything. When you have a world when you have Tolkien, who wrote so much and there's so much to work with, I'm kind of tired of all of these just random stories that are being told and these extra stories that are being told. And so I was really excited to see that we were going to go back into this other age. We were going to go and we were going to hear some of the stories that Tolkien had told already, but also not only that Tolkien had already told, but stories that most people hadn't heard before, and would just help enhance the experience of going through the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? And I was really excited for that. And I think for the most part, they did a really good job. However, and this is where we're going to get into a lot of people's issues with the show, they didn't do a very good job at. They didn't do a very good job at. They tried too hard, I'm going to say, to modernize it, which is really weird. And I think that's the show's biggest flaw, is it couldn't find the balance between honoring Tolkien and what this kind of universe was designed to look like, and the modernization of it. For example, one of the things I noticed right off the bat was the language. It was very Old English, and a lot of people have had issues with dialogue, and I can't help but laugh at that complaint, because it's just like, I don't think they got it, quite frankly. And those are the kind of people who I think just watch the movies, and that's it. And that's fine if that's you, but I don't think they got what Rings of Power was trying to do in honoring Tolkien. I think the Old English, again, helped to immerse you in the experience of what this world is. I didn't find it very distracting at all, and I think it could have easily been distracting. But I thought it was just a nice, subtle detail that enhanced my experience, and also felt like the world that I was in the world that Tolkien created. But that is kind of the complete opposite of modernization. Some people may have been turned off by it. I know of people who got used to it, but it was a little distracting at the beginning. And I totally understand that. Reading Lord of the Rings, despite my love for it, is actually kind of difficult for me at times, because I'm not a very big reader, and it can be hard to get through when you have to really, really think about, at least for me, have to really think about what all the words are trying to say, because it's written in a different time. And so I think it was cool how they still honored that. But at the same time, a lot of people have issues with the characters of this show, particularly in the diversity. There's so many people who are upset that you have diverse leaders in the show, and quite frankly, I just don't understand. While yes, Tolkien probably did not imagine a black female being the queen of Numenor, I don't think that's something that completely destroys a show. I feel like that is modern storytelling, because why can't a black woman be the queen of Numenor? Other than the fact that in Tolkien's time, that wasn't a very accepted idea. And so there is an interesting fight between those two. And so at its core, I think Amazon kind of screwed themselves in trying to find a balance. I think they should have, and I struggle with trying to decide if they made the right choice, or if it would have been better for them to lean more towards one direction or the other. Do we go with honoring Tolkien, and just being pure honoring of Tolkien, or do we try to modernize it? Finding this middle ground, I think, gives you the best of both worlds, but it also gives you the worst of both worlds. And so there's an interesting dynamic that they created there, and I think that's part of where a lot of the friction is coming from. And then with that, you can also add in the strong female lead aspect of it. When you think about it, you have Galadriel, who is very different from the Galadriel that we're all used to seeing in The Lord of the Rings. And people have complained that she isn't like she is in Lord of the Rings, but people forget that elves are immortal and that there are thousands of years in between these these things. They're totally different ages. And so, people are going to change a little bit. But people really did not like Galadriel but she was written that way because she was a strong female character and needed a strong female character. And I don't think Galadriel was written very well as a strong female character. I feel like she was very much written, and quite frankly, I think across the board, all of the strong female characters were written as a very stereotypical versions of those characters. If you want to know if you want a good example of a very well-written strong female character, Sex Education and the character of Maeve is the perfect example. Just because you're strong doesn't mean you have to be, quite frankly, doesn't mean you have to be an a-hole all the time. You can still have emotion and you can still be a person and also be strong. Sometimes that emotion can be what makes you strong. And I think across the board, a lot of the strong female characters in this show were very cookie cutter. You have Galadriel, you have Nori in the Harfoots, you have the one healer lady from the village, and there were a lot of people who one of the complaints is that everybody has to be a strong female character because it's modern. I don't understand why that has to be a bad thing, other than it's very clear that they were written very specifically to be strong female characters, and with all of the things that are going on, I don't think there was enough time to do that super well like it was done with Maeve and Sex Education. And it's something that, again, that's a more of a modernization kind of thing, but also like Tolkien did believe in that as well, because you have characters in Lord of the Rings who are very strong female characters. I mean, Galadriel, I would say, is a pretty strong female character, but also you have Éowyn from Lord of the Rings, who is a very strong female character. While yes, she does have her issues, and she's kind of she's very much feigning for Aragorn's heart. She's still not like she still has a spotlight. I mean, she has one of the most badass lines ever. I mean, pulling out the helmet and saying "I am no man." That is the most like feminist thing of all time, and that's in there. So I don't understand that argument, quite frankly. I don't completely agree with it, but I do want to transition, and it's something I hinted at a second ago. This one of the reasons I wanted to get this episode out, even though I am here by myself, and I'm definitely not the most qualified to talk about a show like this. I wanted to get this episode out this week. Slight tease for next week, because I know that we're going to be referencing this episode quite a bit next week. And that is due to the structure of how this story was told. I said it before, and I'll say it again. My biggest issue with modern TV is the need to tell multiple stories within this one show. And I find it extremely frustrating, and sometimes I might be really interested in one, maybe even two aspects of a show, and I don't care about the rest, but I still have to watch them, and I still have to try to be invested in them, so I can learn more about what's going on in the stories that I am invested in. And so I feel like something that a lot of shows are struggling with right now, and this is my personal opinion, it's why I struggle to watch shows, quite frankly, is the balance of keeping me invested in every aspect of the show and all of the side arcs that are going on. It's one of the reasons that I think Sex Education is so good, particularly season 1. While there are lots of side stories, they did such a good job at getting me invested in all of the characters that I was okay with branching out. And as the seasons went on, the show definitely did go astray in that philosophy, and we did, especially in season 3, got a little crazy with all the things that were happening, and it did get to a point where I wasn't so invested anymore, and I just wanted to get back to some of the main crew. For the most part, did a fantastic job. If you go back, one of the greatest shows of all time, I think, just in general, would be Breaking Bad. I think a general audience would say that is one of the greatest shows of all time. And Breaking Bad is throughout the entire show about one story. It's about Walter White. And sure, sometimes we might go astray. We might explore something going on with like Jesse or his wife or whatever. But at the core of the show, but all of those side stories are serving the core of the show, and that is Walter White's journey into becoming a meth lord. Sex Education, season 1 in particular, you have all these side stories, but all of those stories are in service of the primary objective, which is the relationship between Otis and Maeve. And I'm not saying that that is the only way that shows should be done, while it's definitely my favorite, probably because it's more movie-like. I think one of the ways that shows should be surprisingly aren't used often enough, in my opinion, is ways to tell a grander story than what you can tell in 2 hours like you can with a feature film. With that, like, you can explore these other characters, but if you took the primary stuff, if you took the primary goals and everything, you could probably still create a feature film there. But having that extended runtime, multiple episodes, you can explore a few different characters and things and bring them together, and you can everything can kind of just take a little bit longer, and it can feel a little more natural at times. But I'm not saying that things have to be done in that way. And I think a good example of that would be Better Call Saul. And I think that in general right there is just, I think mentioning Better Call Saul after just talking about Breaking Bad is just an example of Peter Gould being a fantastic storyteller. But Better Call Saul, like, one of my biggest complaints with that is that you kind of, throughout the show, you have these stories of the stuff going on with Jimmy / Saul, but you also have the stuff going on with Mike and Nacho and all of this drug stuff going on, right? And so you have two very different things, and neither one of them really serves the other. Sure, a few times every season, the two kind of cross over, and they're able to, a couple times a season, like, the two will cross over and they're able to help each other out, and they're able to push each other's stories in different directions. But the two stories, quite frankly, don't really serve each other. They're all pretty independent. You could have two different shows about these two different characters and would work just fine. Both of them would work just fine. I think they would both be great, actually. But they are put together because, as a whole, it's a prequel to Breaking Bad, and it's in this universe. And so I don't know if the only reason it works is because it is a prequel, and maybe that's why, but I also think that one of the reasons it's okay is because I am so invested in both stories. While personally, I would prefer to only see the stuff going on with Jimmy / Saul. I'm also not typically too upset when I am getting stuff with Mike and Gus and all the craziness that's going on with selling drugs and working with the cartel. And so, like, there are different options, different ways you can tell stories. But I think a lot of shows now get a little carried away, and they try to do the multiple things. And so they try to have one central idea, like the first structural TV structure. So like the first TV structure example I gave, a lot of shows try to have a central idea and then lots of stories surrounding that to serve it. But they also have a lot of those side stories have nothing to do with the central point, kind of like Better Call Saul, that second example I gave. And so when you put the two together, it does not work very well for me at all. And most shows are like this now, and I don't care. And quite frankly, Rings of Power on the surface is a lot like this. You have, especially in at the start of the first two episodes, I was really concerned because you have all of these different stories that quite frankly have nothing to do with each other. You have the stuff with the Harfoots, and then you have Galadriel and her mission, and then you have the Númenóreans, and then you have Elrond and the dwarves, and all of this stuff is happening all at once. And while it's cool, and I'm invested in a lot of it, and while it's cool, it doesn't really work together very well. But one of the reasons that, you have all these stories going on, and on the surface, it shouldn't work very well. At least that's in my head. That's what I'm thinking as I'm watching these first 2 episodes. I'm scared immediately, like seeing all the signs of this is exactly what I don't like in TV. But they did a few things that made it okay. Number one, I was immediately invested in the characters and their missions and what was going on. I feel like they were telling lots of real stories. I mean, Elrond and Durin are literally it's just them. It's like Romeo and Juliet, but for bros. They're just bros, and they're trying to work it out. And also, like, they discover Mithril. And then you have, this nice romance with the one elf and the one medic chick. And they're trying to save their village. And then you have Galadriel, who's working with this really crazy dude who's totally not Sauron. And they go to Numenor. Numenor is really cool. And you have a lot of really great individual stories that on their own work really well. And quite frankly, if this show was completely structured like a majority of them, and all of these kind of side arcs didn't have much to do with each other, you could make this an anthology series, I think, and then just tell these individual stories. And at first I thought that it should have been an anthology. But as the show progressed, I quickly realized that there were little lines and threads that were going to be connected as the show progressed. And I think when those threads did connect, it only made the individual stories better. Each of the individual stories were all serving each other. And I think that was really, really cool. When we got to episode 6, Undun, which I feel like has to be everybody's favorite episode. I mean, come on. The episode was fantastic. It kind of felt like a finale to Stranger Things, where all of these side arcs, because Stranger Things does kind of the same thing, really. Just about every season, you have all of these different stories that have nothing to do with each other. And then at the end, typically like the penultimate episode, they all come together and all the threads tie together. And then you get the finale where it all, ends. And Undun episode 6 definitely felt very similar, because all of a sudden you have all of these stories coming together very, at least for me, a little unexpectedly. It made sense, but as I'm watching, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to connect here, and this is going to connect, and now all these characters are going to meet, and they're going to interact. But at the same time, they were still able to at the same time, each character was still going on their own journey, and so we're still able to explore those individual journeys. But now that they were together, they were able to help each other and push each other into the different directions that their story was going in. And that was really, really cool. And I loved it, and I wish more shows would do something like that. Rings of Power and Stranger Things are 2 perfect examples of having very separate stories that tie together really well. And it's just done brilliantly, quite frankly. And I wish more shows would do that. Now, Rings of Power did not do this perfectly. It was done really, really well, and I really liked it as a whole, but it was not done perfectly because you also have this side arc with the Harfoots, and I get it. Hobbits, everyone loves hobbits. They're famous. They're really popular. I don't need to know the origins of the hobbits and how they used to be Harfoots, and particularly with a story that has nothing to do with anything. Now, this is only season 1 of potentially 5, so maybe this story will come into play a little more, especially with whoever this wizard is. My guess is Gandalf, but there's also pretty good arguments that it might be Saruman. So I'm sure it'll come into play later on in later seasons. But for season 1 in particular, it was just, I was never super excited for the Harfoots. I was always entertained. It always looked really beautiful. It was cool to see a different culture within this world. But as a whole, I didn't care for the Harfoots, and I could have gone without that entire story arc. But considering how much was going on, and how sometimes and how the writers of the show recognize that if we don't have time for the Harfoots, we're not going to push them in. Like in episode 6, Udun, I don't think we go into that story at all, and that's good. It focus on story, not on maintaining a certain, not focus on story, not trying to make sure we're giving every individual story arc time in each episode. If it doesn't deserve the time, or if the time isn't needed, then let's not give it that time, especially with episodes that are pretty much feature length, coming in at well over an hour every time. Now, I want to wrap up the show by taking a second to dive in a little bit into honoring source material. That was initially kind of the idea behind a second segment, but I feel like it's just me, and so we're just going to make it all one big segment because I can do that. As I've gone through, I mean, you can't help but compare live action adaptations of books and writings and things to the source material. It's going to happen. And I feel like at a certain point, now I'm going to tie all of this up together with now, if I had to tie all this together with a particular theme, I would say that it really what this comes down to, particularly with people who did like the show and people who didn't, is how heavily they rely on, or how heavily they value honoring the source material and how they would define that. Because I feel like if you break down all of the points and things I've been making throughout the show, I feel like that's really what it comes down to, is how is Amazon and the creative behind Rings of Power honoring Tolkien and his original writings and his initial stories. And for me, I think they did a really good job, especially considering all of the other attempts at doing it with The Hobbit and other video games and things like that. I feel like Rings of Power has done a fantastic job. While, yes, they have changed the story a bit, some of the details, particularly with Sauron, with the crafting of the rings, aren't entirely accurate. It's close enough with the format that they're telling, with the episodes that they have. The way that they're doing it makes total sense, in my opinion. I think the Lord of the Rings trilogy is Peter Jackson's trilogy, is the best movie to book adaptation or book to movie adaptation of all time, closely followed by the Harry Potter series. And I think Harry Potter is a much better example because with Peter Jackson's extended cuts, you get a vast majority of those books, except Tom Bombadil. That's the greatest cinema sin of all time. But besides the lack of Tom Bombadil in Peter Jackson's trilogy, it is fantastic. But I think the Harry Potter series is a better example because those movies are a lot shorter and a much more normal Hollywood blockbuster movie length. Because while, yes, there are things that you can't include, and because of that, the books are always going to be so much better than the movies, those films are fantastic, particularly the first 3, because those stories are so quote-unquote basic. They're very simple stories. There's not a lot going on. Those books are relatively short. They're the 3 shortest of the series, and so they're able to fit a lot more in. But I think the way that the Harry Potter series was done was really well. And while, yes, we didn't have Dobby helping Harry discover the gillyweed before the second tournament in Goblet of Fire, like it was in the books, we got Neville giving him the gillyweed in the movies. And at the end of the day, while that's a very small detail, it made more sense for the films because Neville was a bigger character, and as we go through, it helped develop Neville's character in the shorter period of time that we were allowed to have with Neville, as opposed to the books where you can have as many pages as you want with Neville because it's a book and you have a lot more time. Dobby, quite frankly, isn't as big of a character, as an important of a character, I suppose, as you go on. And please don't yell at me. Let me elaborate further. Dobby's arc is able to be conveyed throughout the films with his 2 appearances, I want to say. First in Chamber of Secrets and then later in Deathly Hallows Part 1. You're still able to get the impact of why he's in Deathly Hallows Part 1. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who is potentially hasn't read it or seen it yet, which is a little sad if you haven't. But you still get that full impact. But when you see Neville grow throughout the films and you see him, kind of taking a lead and you see him showing his strengths and kind of seeing where he might be getting his confidence from, that really helps to build up in the last film where all of that kind of comes to conclusion and Neville has his own side arc. And so, while it isn't very accurate to the books in that regard, they did make certain changes that allowed them to tell a better story in the film format. And I think that's something that people forget a lot. I think a lot of times people just immediately say, it makes sense, the book is really long, they only have 2 hours for the movie, so they're going to change things. And yes, that's true. And that is also what I'm saying. It's a little more, there's a little more depth to that. You have to tell the story that a movie gives you the opportunity to tell. And sometimes you can go a little crazy, like with The Lightning Thief, for example, and you just completely go off your rocker and you tell a completely random story that has nothing, really has no relation or correlation to the books at all. I think, book to film adaptations can be really difficult, just in determining how can you use film to elevate what the initial source material was trying to convey. And I think that one of the ways that Rings of Power was able to do this, again, like with the detail, like books can tell you that this place is really great, but actually seeing the vast just beauty of Numenor and all of everything that comes with that is so much more impactful. And you can do a lot of different things in a film format, and you can kind of take some liberties in there and create something that looks really cool to help convey what the book and the initial source material was trying to say. And so I think Rings of Power did a really great job at adapting the source material to the film/TV format. A lot of people disagree with me because it's not entirely accurate, but I think that's okay. I don't think you need it to be entirely accurate. As I said, Tolkien was from a different time, and so introducing diversity and strong female characters, I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that's fine. We love more diversity. I don't think it matters if I don't think the color of a character's skin really matters in the grand scheme of things. It's the character's journey. And if they want to make it more inclusive, then go for it. I don't really mind too much, as long as it's not hurting the story, which in this case it absolutely didn't. So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. If you couldn't tell, I really enjoyed Rings of Power. But I am curious because there is, like I said at the top of the show, this seems like a very controversial show. What were your thoughts on Rings of Power? Did you like it as much as I did? Did you not like it so much? Why or why not? Let us know on all of the things: Instagram, TikTok, patreon.com/thepopcornhangover. I gave a bit of a tease earlier in terms of story structure. I will say that next week we are going to be talking about another show that is wrapping up, and it is one we've talked about a bit on the podcast, and I think that's enough of a hint for you. You can figure it out. With that, yeah, that's all I got for you. Peace.